MP Dunkley,
That's me.
you have your 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I speak tonight on a matter that has grave consequences and certainly, I believe, serious implications to our island home. A matter, Mr. Speaker, that after the shock announcement earlier this week has seen little explanation or understanding from the powers that be to the people of Bermuda, Mr. Speaker. Former Premier, the longest serving Premier of Bermuda, Sir John Swan, said earlier, and he hit the nail right on the head, and I quote him, Premier Byrd has a crisis on his hands. Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, I support that sentiment. There is a crisis, whether the Premier and any colleagues acknowledge it or admit it or not. Sir John Swan said it, and many people believe it, Mr. Speaker, and thank him for speaking out. It was a shock resignation that caught the country by surprise, and it appears caught many of the political colleagues of the member by surprise. Mr. Speaker, to me, I believe it unbelievable, Mr. Speaker, that what I consider a respected member of the House, certainly a respected minister, has resigned so suddenly. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I believe during the resignation would have been 11 days to the budget debate, Mr. Speaker. A very respected member of the House of Assembly. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, to put it in context, because while my colleagues and I sit on the other side of the House, it is very clear that we have had some good debates with the Honorable former Minister. They've lacked any political contention, and the former minister, has been all about business. But we must look at the facts at the present time, Mr. Speaker. In my view, the most respected PLP minister has resigned. One of the most important ministers, the Minister of Finance, I believe after the Premier, is the most important minister, has resigned. Doing so very close to the budget is certainly a very concerning situation. Typically, Mr. Speaker, the budget is around Valentine's Day, so the budget is about 2 weeks late anyway, Mr. Speaker. It's a real concern at this time, Mr. Speaker, because the economy is in turmoil. There are many questions that need to be answered. People need to know what the plan is for the government. Thank God, while the economy might be struggling in many areas, we have international business that is still very strong. But the rest of the economy seriously needs some attention and work. Tourism is bleak. Our airlift, Mr. Speaker, is very weak at the moment, and there are many questions, I think, about what the airlift will be going forward, Mr. Speaker, through the summer period. Projections for 2022 appear to be somewhat sketchy at this time, Mr. Speaker, as far as hotel occupancy. There's no doubt unemployment is high. That's exacerbated by the pandemic. The cost of living is high. Inflation continues to rise, not only here in Bermuda, but throughout the world, and that will have an impact, Mr. Speaker, on our cost of living and our inflation rate. Mr. Speaker, COVID has wrecked our economy in many, many different areas. Many Bermudians are struggling, but at the same time, Mr. Speaker, many Bermudians have left the island, and many Bermudians are considering leaving the island, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, sadly, I speak facts that are not pleasant. Sadly, I speak the reality that many are feeling with. Mr. Speaker, the question we ask, what took place? What is going on? But it's against a backdrop, Mr. Speaker, that within less than a month, we have seen 3 resignations that have all shocked the community. The first was the chief scientist in the pandemic, through the COVID pandemic, resigned very quickly in early January, effective at the end of January. The scientists that government had lauded, and we all lauded for the work that had been done, the tireless contribution through day and night through this extended period of time. Secondly was the resignation of a senator who, most unfortunately and disappointingly, was not paying rent to a senior landlady. And now, this week, the shock resignation of the Minister of Finance. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, a respected man, the most respected PLP minister resigned. Just think about that for a moment. Resignations happen all the time, all across the world. But for somebody in that position to resign, Mr. Speaker, it is very curious and concerning. This was the minister who has the purse strings and appeared committed to balancing our budget. That was constant conversation from the Minister of Finance through these years. Committed, he appeared committed to improving the economy. And Mr. Speaker, whether you agreed with policy or not, this minister, like the former minister, Bob Richards, he knew the numbers. He was prepared. After all, that was his career. Mr. Speaker, for the honorable member to resign and do it so suddenly and at such a critical time requires thorough analysis and critique, Mr. Speaker, and most importantly, I believe it requires explanation. Well, why, Mr. Speaker? Because red lights are flashing, alarm bells are ringing, and people need to know. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member has not spoken at this time, and maybe he will later in motion to adjourn, or maybe at another time. The Premier has offered very little or no understanding. So the mystery and the concern continues to rise, in my view, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, what's more concerning to me is the fact that the honorable member that I know, I took as somebody who was very dedicated, very committed to his task. He took great pride in the work that he did, Mr. Speaker. And I believe he always liked to finish the job that he started, Mr. Speaker. But he didn't do that this time. He made the decision to leave. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that decision to leave wasn't an easy one. I'm sure it was a very tough one. But, Mr. Speaker, it appears that that divide between the Premier and the Honorable former Finance Minister was just not closable. That's a concern from a respected minister. It appears that the differences of opinion, policy, and approach on issues was not reconcilable, Mr. Speaker. That is a real concern when you lose a respected minister. The relation appears irreparable, Mr. Speaker. That is a concern. So, Mr. Speaker, the people that we serve, they deserve some understanding. They deserve some answers. They deserve some insight. It cannot be glossed over. It cannot be covered up, because quality in important positions is critical if we're going to get out of this mess. And we lost somebody who was respected. Whether you agreed with opinion, whether your politics were different, we lost somebody who was respected. So I look forward to the Premier and the honorable member to speak. If the silence remains, Mr. Speaker, the trust and the support will erode continuously in the PLP government, and we don't need that, Mr. Speaker. Let me be very clear. The PLP have a huge, significant majority. They are the government. But sadly, very sadly, the current leader and the Premier of this country has once again failed with poor decisions, poor leadership, failed promises, and critical, repeated resignations. That's a worrying trend, Mr. Speaker. Now, no one's perfect, and explanations can help us get through this matter, Mr. Speaker. But one of the best on the PLP side walked out the door. And when you couple this with some of the other political news stories, such as $3.6 million that was paid out without a bid process, when you couple this with the economy that will struggle over time, and the economic plan that the government has presented has not been gripped strongly by the community, when you couple this with the support for some failed initiatives such as arbitrate, when you couple this with failed promises that haven't made the light of day yet, Mr. Speaker, there is a big gap between words and delivery. And that gulf, Mr. Speaker, breeds a lack of confidence and hope in the people of Bermuda. In my opinion, the shine has come off the ball, and the resignation, Mr. Speaker, has exposed the Premier. And no one in government wants...
Just let me remind you, turn your video on. I just noticed the video is still off.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Speaker, it must have gone off because I turned it on. But anyway, can you see me now? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just click it again until it comes up. You should be okay.
Got it now? Nate?
You must have a
Yes.
yeah, there you go. Good.
It's showing it's on now, Mr. Speaker. Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, what I was saying is that no one to date wants to address this challenge. The article that came out early in this week, and I'll refer to it, Mr. Speaker, in the Royal Gazette, was titled "Dickinson Will Be Hard to Replace, but Not Impossible." And in that article, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of members in the PLP who said very little, and one member wasn't even aware that the resignation had taken place. That's quite concerning, Mr. Speaker, that suggests a lack of communication between the various entities in government, and that's very concerning. But in that article also, it talked about it will not be impossible to replace the former minister. So what happened, Mr. Speaker? The Premier puts himself as the Minister of Finance. So now we have the Premier, Minister of Finance, and Minister of Tourism. Really, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, obviously, the Premier doesn't have faith in the talent around him. That's my view, Mr. Speaker. I'd like the air to be cleared on that, because for any person to hold three positions like that, it has to be very difficult, nearly impossible to carry out those functions. There's not enough time in the day, Mr. Speaker. Not enough time in the day to do the responsibilities of the Premier, which are 24/7. Then to do the responsibilities of Minister of Finance, with the difficult economy that we have, and the government budget that is in poor shape, with the increasing debt that we have, with the potential for blacklists that we have, Mr. Speaker. Not enough time in the day. And then when you add tourism to that, that is struggling, and our competitors seem to be beating us hand over fist. This won't end well, Mr. Speaker. The wheels in Premier's leadership are falling off at a critical time for Bermuda. It's not acceptable. Mr. Speaker, we need to do better than this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 30 members in the government benches. Power is now concentrated in the hands in the most important ministries in one person. And you mean to tell me, Mrs. Speaker, that there's no one else.
MP meeting, I think your mic is on.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Minister Meeting, rather.
Mr. Speaker, it sends a message that there was no one else capable to help carry the load in those very difficult ministries. So, Mr. Speaker, does the Premier listen to his cabinet? Why did the most respected minister walk out the door? Does the Premier trust his cabinet? Who does the Premier listen to? Does the Premier have a kitchen cabinet who provides him advice? Mr. Speaker, we face challenging times. This Premier has lost the confidence in the people of Bermuda. And I challenge members of the government tonight to stand up and show their confidence in the Premier, because that's what the people of Bermuda want to see. They want to see they still support this Premier, because he's lost the confidence in the people of Bermuda, and we face critical, challenging times. The best member, the best minister, just walked out the door, Mr. Speaker. It's not a good sign. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Dunkley. Does any other member wish to speak?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.